Good morning, good afternoon. Hope you're doing well. It's coffee time this beautiful day, beautiful blue sky day. Hope everything's going well for you. As always, keep me posted if you have questions over everything. I super appreciate all of your work and engagement, involvement in the class. The papers overall are just amazing. You all do amazing work in terms of summarizing the lecture stuff and then also getting into the articles and content. This week, we're moving into the social construction of gender, and sort of the purpose of this video is to kind of walk through some main concepts, ideas, perspectives, some of them a little bit more abstract than others. Some of them you may have been introduced to before, some of it relatively new. So hopefully you find the information interesting, informative, and engaging. We have a podcast this week, which is a really good podcast from The Hidden Brain, an NPR produced program called Nature, Nurture, and Our Evolving Debates About Gender. I think it lays out a nice foundation of this sort of biological determinist side, this nature argument versus the nurture. And the evidence really aligns itself. It's not that nature does not exist in terms of its influence, in terms of our behavior and who we are as gendered individuals. But gender gets us into the nurture sort of idea. So this podcast kind of unpackages it a little bit and sort of gets us into, well, why is that distinction important? We'll talk about that in class as well. And then the article from some research by Pascoe, who she kind of looked at homophobia and expressions of homophobia, and the culmination of her research came into a book called "Dude, You're a Fag: Discourse Among Adolescent Youth." So super interesting. Sort of, we'll talk about that in this lecture as well. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and get started. Let me go to share screen here. All right. So I don't know, one way to approach this, kind of think about, I don't remember week one, I believe we talked a little bit about C. Wright Mills and the sociological imagination, and we can talk about it again here for a moment. The sociological imagination encourages us to think about the social context, the historical context, the cultural context in which we live. To develop an imagination, to develop a sense of curiosity, of inquiry into the social world. And in part to do that because historically we could look at sort of race and biological notions of race, biological notions of gender. If we don't become critical in a good way, analysis and critique of the existing social order, we're just reproducing a social order. And oftentimes that social order may have some problems in it. It may have some inequities, maybe in reinforcing inequities. So it's important that we stop, pause, take a reflection, develop an imagination. And to develop an imagination, we have to step away from our own preconceived cultural notions of the way things should be, the way we believe things that are normal, the way things that we kind of come to see as like, this is just the world how it is, right? And we talk about it sort of the taken for granted world. So we really try to challenge this sort of taken for granted world. For example, males are just better at math. Males are more analytical. Okay, let's pause for a minute. Let's talk about sort of why. Let's no longer take that for granted, that cultural belief, and try to understand sort of where does that come from? Is there truth to it? Is it objective? What are the cultural components to that? And really kind of examine things. And ultimately, for C. Wright Mills too, it's about trying to connect our own biography of who we are to the larger social forces. So, I am an individual, you are an individual, but we are also shaped by social forces. So it's looking at and being able to understand, for example, for myself, my ways in which I express my gender, the way I identify in terms of my own gender identity is part individual biography, but that biography is shaped by the larger cultural, social context. To be male, self-identified male today would be different than it was in the 1950s versus 1900s versus 1850s. Depends on, the region of the country, the identified race, all these different factors. So when we look at sociology of gender, to go down the next point here, is we're looking at basically the interaction between the micro, the individual, and the macro, and everything in between. So culture, context, history, social structure, all that macro stuff, all the way to the micro level. Let's not worry about Durkheim social facts. Got a lot of stuff to kind of cover here. I guess real briefly, it's not an essential point. It kind of hits on with C. Wright Mills a little bit, is social facts are those things that are external to us that influence us, that shape us. And it's kind of a foundational thing in the formation of sociology, and Durkheim formed a perspective about that we may identify things as being individually caused and have an individual, very micro level analysis. And Durkheim was encouraging us to examine the social facts, the patterns of human behavior themselves. And that'll become relevant in the next slide. That's the functionalist kind of, a little bit. The Marxist view, the conflict theory view, is the examination of looking at ideologies or belief, ideological control, about how the beliefs in society can kind of reinforce inequalities, looking at inequalities from the macro structural level all the way to the interactional level, inequities. So that's kind of a Marxist perspective. The interactionist perspective gets us into understanding our own self-identity, our self-concept, the meanings and our perceptions in terms of the meanings that we assign to the world, that we assign to self and others. So it's kind of just wanted to bring that up just to kind of just kind of revisit our sociological theories so we don't lose those. This is kind of a good example of social facts. If we look at eating disorders, I think most people recognize that the number of women who are experiencing eating disorders versus the number of men. And I think, to bring intersectionality in here would be important too, to look at the class of the individuals, the social class, the race of the individuals, the region of the country would be different as well. So I think intersectionality becomes really important. So I think most people can think about, oh man, the power of the social media to shape this idea of the ideal body form and the judgment, self-judgment, judgment of others that go along with that. People recognize the social facts of that, right? Of the power and the influence of the social world on oneself. Other things get, because of our cultural values, get a little bit trickier. We look at poverty, for example, and we start to identify the social facts, oftentimes get a lot of pushback, like this cultural belief that it's only individual responsibility for one's sort of social position in life. And there's just a fundamental flaw in that kind of like view of the total individual kind of perspective. Is like, I think you have to account for, we can recognize social facts when it comes to eating disorders. Why we can't do that with something like poverty raises all kinds of interesting questions. Anyway, don't want to get too far down that pathway. So when looking at the sociological approach to self and identity, I can read part of this, is that we look at self and identity, we're looking at the reciprocal relationship between the self and society. So our identities are shaped in context, right? So the self influences society through our actions. So we have an influence in the social world based on our behavior, based on our attitudes, our disposition, the way we engage in the world, and vice versa. Society influences us, right? And so this is part of the development of self. Self emerges in this sort of reflective, interactive relationship between the self and the social world. This is a kind of a summary from a book on sort of looking at self-identity. Anyway, so we're looking at that interaction of identity between self and the context in which we live in. And a couple of sociological sort of views of the development of self is really focusing on the sort of how do we learn, when we're looking about gender, how do we learn our sense of gender, how do we develop gender, our gendered identity? It doesn't come to us biologically. It's a learned process. And so George Herbert Mead, one theorist who sort of proposes sort of an idea that we go through different stages of development. We don't need to focus on all the three stages of development that he talked about. But let me just kind of highlight a couple different things that he brings up along the sort of stages of development. At some point in relatively young years, 5, 6, 7, let's say, kids start to, they think before they act. And this goes on well before 5, 6, 7, but kids start to categorize the social world. There's a theory called gender schema theory where people start to develop like categories and start putting things into categories of what belongs in the male box, the female box. And I think increasingly, we have transgender box as well that may be a little bit less talked about and less defined as a culture. Um, as a culture. But me's perspective is we think before we act. So in learning our behavior, we're paying attention to those that are around us, and we're thinking about, um, thinking about repercussions of our behavior, our thoughts, our actions. We're evaluating. We're taking the role of another. So I'm imagining, for example, looking at gender, I'm imagining what would my male peers think about if I crossed my legs or behaved in a particular way? What would my other individuals who are male in my world, what would even this sort of the generalized utter, this imagined this dominant sort of viewpoint from society? I'm imagining what is appropriate, what is not appropriate in terms of male gendered behavior. And same with, take the role of female too. What is it, and understand my own gender identity or developing it, I'm also stepping into and taking the role of female as well, and trying to understand, and trying to understand how might, a friend of mine who's female think about this particular behavior. If I said this, what would be the reaction response? And these are all important. What Mead would talk about, this is how we start to develop a sense of self-awareness and how we start to develop a sense of kind of like our own identity. Mead distinguishes between the I and the me. The I is the sense of who we are in response to our thoughts and ideas around others. Actually, I kind of got the other way around. So back up a second. So the I is sort of more based on the less concerned about the reaction from others, not within a social context. I use the example in class oftentimes about, somebody picking one's nose while driving. Oftentimes an individual, if they're not aware that they're being observed, there can be in this sort of I moment. But the minute that somebody notices somebody's looking at them, their behavior and demeanor changes. They become a me, they become the object. And so our behavior kind of can be shaped or influenced by whether or not we are sort of have this sort of a thought and idea that we're being viewed by others or that we are not. Okay, so one more kind of component, think about it. So Goffman has this perspective, Irving Goffman, who basically, devoted his life to the micro level perspective, talks about the social, the interaction ritual. And it comes up with this idea of dramaturgy, that basically life is like a theater. We are actors on a stage. We have a gendered script, for example. There's a gendered set that goes along with it. You kind of, you can apply the ideas of theater and to get us to start thinking about role performance. There's script, there's a costume, there's a demeanor, there's a presentation of self would be the language of Goffman. I try to find these sunglasses I had. These weren't the pair, but a couple of years ago I started buying. I don't know, just like going to the dollar store, buying these cool like sunglasses. A lot of them were very feminine, but it's kind of interesting. These are not. These are much more masculine in nature. Sunglasses. I mean, anything that we wear, the way we present ourselves to the public, is part of our dramaturgical self. By wearing, I was buying these glasses that were like, the colors and the frames were super round and big. People in our culture identify as very feminine, and I'd wear these glasses, and most times people wouldn't comment, but every once in a while people would comment. And it's interesting, right? Because I was violating a gendered script about what was appropriate and what was not appropriate. And so I don't know, just encourage us to sort of think about sort of script language. We perform gender. Gender is a performance. It's not something that we just carry within us, but it's something that we demonstrate. And that's an important feature too. Part of this idea for Goffman is that we're engaged in impression management. That's kind of what we do as humans, right? We're engaged in managing our impressions among our peer group, our family members, coworkers. So not just fundamental human behavior, right? And part of impression management is managing our gender presentation. We have what Goffman talks about: a front stage, backstage, off stage. Front stage is when we're interacting with an audience. Backstage is when we're getting ready for the performance. And then off stage, when we're not even concerned about going to be, performance. So think about it going meeting a coworker for lunch. It's like, okay, backstage getting ready for the lunch meeting, front stage, the lunch meeting itself, off stage, away from the workplace. So anyway, it's the sort of interaction between actor and audience. You can look at advertising as a great sort of a lot of dramaturgical sort of stuff, the body, the posturing, the things that we could sort of unpackage. And there's been a lot of stuff about that. Oh man, so okay. Cooley and the Looking Glass Self, sort of another idea about development of self is the looking glass self. So we develop ideas of who we are based on how we imagine others see us. So it's like this looking glass self that's being held up to us. So not only how I imagine other people see me, but how they also react and respond to me. So it's my perceptions as well as perceptions of their response, my perceptions of what they think, as well as it's also, what individuals and how they are responding. The looking glass self can happen at the micro level, that social interaction. So thinking about how a friend of mine might perceive me. That's an important part of self-development. Cooley talks about society and self are twin born. There is no self without immersion into society. If you ever heard about feral children are children who are socialized away from human contact. They don't develop a secure sense or a sense of self-identity. So you have to be immersed in a social system in order to develop a self-identity. So Cooley talks about sort of this idea that this looking glass self, this image that we see, the perception that we see, our perception of how others view us. And by extension, others have our perception of how others view and think about individuals who are similar to me in terms of demographics. One demographic could be gender, class, race, sexual identity, and other areas of our identities. We could get into a lot of stuff about media representation could get us into this looking glass self. Who do we see being represented? How are people being represented? How does that sort of shape what I start to think about myself in terms of what's possible, what I should and should not do, and these kind of things. Okay, it's a lot of background information. Let's kind of move now into differentiating between sex and gender. Sex is defined as the biological component of who we are, and gender is the social and cultural. The reality is that there is an interaction going on there. We have a biological self and we have a gendered self. We have a social cultural component. The challenge becomes one of oftentimes historically what we assign in terms of sex is actually gender. Even today, we do this today. And there's we provide a strong critique of this sort of sex or biologically determinist viewpoint in terms of individuals, male, female. So for example, males are just, this is a cultural belief and still is today that males are better at math, that males have stronger analytical skills. And when we say that, that puts it into the sex, right? That's biological, like males are. So we're not saying that males have been socialized to be, or males have been encouraged, males have been supported, right? Or males see themselves in terms of being stronger in these ways. We place it in terms of the realm of sex versus gender, sort of the biological side. And there's a lot of mythology to that. There's a lot of the narrative, the cultural narrative that we tell that males are better at this and females are better at this. Males are just, that a lot of that stuff is a justification for certain ways of thinking and doing. It comes out of a cultural context and environment. So we got to kind of think about those things. I mean, even the areas of, height difference between males and females, there is a difference, and you can say it's a sex difference. Muscle mass, sex difference between males and females in terms of like, if you look at a bell curve. But we have to be careful there too, is that there are some females that have more muscle mass than more muscle mass than males, that are taller than males. So it's, it's a bell curve, but bell curves are overlapping as well. And so we got to be careful we're not assigning it as biologically determined. You could sort of say interactive for sure, but being very careful that we don't move it into the realm of biology if it's not biology, and be aware of social and cultural forces. So it gets us into the social construction, like how we constructed ideas of masculinity and femininity, how we constructed ideas of female and male, how we constructed ideas about transgender as well. I like this term, like masculinities or femininities, to recognize it's plural, right? So we use intersectional theory. So it's plural. Masculinities are, so it's not that there's one form of masculinity. It's masculinities. I mean, it's race, class. It's shaped by race. It's shaped by class. Shaped by region of the country and culture. It's like there's a lot of different masculinities that are part of that. There's no singular sex role. There's a lot of different ones because it's complicated by culture and social forces. Now let's talk about hegemony and hegemonic masculinity. So the hegemony is domination by consent, domination by involvement. It's the dominant cultural belief, attitude, position. So sometimes like the hegemonic masculine ideal is something that's just so grounded into culture and society that we have a hard time disrupting it. It's the accepted way of being and doing and knowing. And then we don't even think about it. We see it as being natural and then we take it for granted. And it's very hard to challenge and disrupt that hegemonic sort of ideal in terms of masculinity. Masculinity is constructed as, in relationship to femininity. This was just as if we were looking at race, that the dominant race is shaped by the categorization of other races as well. So there's a relationship between masculinity and femininity. Okay, so we defined about hegemony. Hegemony does not mean violence, although it could be supported by force. It's ascendancy, it's dominant position achieved through culture, institutions, and persuasion. So males are, for example, with this cultural belief that males are better leaders, for example, we reinforce that, both males and females in our culture and society. Less so today, but it's still prominent. It's still a feature of our culture, a belief within our culture, and we reproduce that belief system. It's not coming from only the top down, it's coming from the social body itself. And that's kind of an important idea of hegemony. It's not looking at oppression and privileging and advantaging from the top. It's interactive. It's much more complete. It's from all levels within social organization. So it's kind of walks through it. It's like, okay, we get socialized into ideas of gender. Part of those ideas of gender are reinforcing ideas of power inequities between different groups. That leads to inequities in society itself. We reproduce sort of these ideas about masculinity, patriarchy, domination, this sort of belief and idea about male dominance that reinforces a patriarchal society and then just kind of repeats itself. So it kind of goes around and round. We can break down the hegemonic masculinity in 4 different ways too. Think about it as a hierarchy, that masculinities are placed on a hierarchy. If we intersect race, class, and gender with it together, we can see that not all ideas of masculinity are ranked in the same way. That there is a hierarchy, and that hierarchy is being shaped by these other parts of our identity. We also have to think about with gender, as with other areas of life, there is part of agency. We have influence over things. There is individual involvement and engagement, but there's also constraints that are structural and cultural constraints in terms of that are shaping our attitudes or shaping our behavior. Masculinity is interrelated with femininity. So we kind of already talked about that a little bit. Second area we could look at with hegemonic masculinity is geography, or look at sort of levels or kind of like degrees of a circle, right? The local, the regional, the global, sort of all these different things, and they're all interrelated all the way from the micro level to the macro level. So it's really kind of talking about the micro and the macro level connection. Third area of hegemonic masculinity to sort of look at is that we embody it. So it's a practice, something that we do, but it's something that we embody as well. And then, a good example of this, okay, so Pasco's work on looking at masculinity and sexuality in high school. Boys calling each other, you're queer, you're such a fag, don't be such a queer, don't be such a sissy, all these different kind of things. They're ways of reinforcing boundaries around masculinity. These are, boys at that age in high school, they're defining sort of those boundaries between what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. They're reinforcing a particular social and cultural world without even knowing that they're actually doing that, right? So they're embodying it. They're engaged in a social practice through their communication and their actions. And they're reinforcing sort of this dominant kind of script about masculinity within culture and society itself. Um, and then kind of the last area is like it's more dynamic than being very stable, right? So ideas about gender, sometimes if we're in one context versus another, our ideas about gender are shaped by those in those different environments. Going to a music concert versus going to theater versus going to a funeral, going to a wedding, an interview. I mean, change context may change. There's a different script involved in those different areas. I mean, our ideas of gender are being practiced differently in those different areas as well. And then, of course, we could go more macro level and go into culture and societal and social forces as well. I mean, I'll provide some advertisement, just kind of like get it some hegemonic masculinity stuff. I think we could look back, this sort of like look back 1950s, 1960s, 70s, whatever it might be, and look at sort of this like dominant masculine stuff. We can kind of see the roles being played out. I think like this one here is pretty dominant forms of femininity in terms of body and beauty. You look at body posture, think about dramaturgy here, think about dramaturgy, in different aspects of these ads. So there's a lot of stuff like gender stuff that we can kind of look at. More recent advertisements, I mean, just like, it's really interesting to look at advertisement across time. Again, sort of this dominant form, male standing over female, very hypersexualization as a 1990s and on. There's sexualization going on here too, but it's hypersexualization. That's kind of something we'll talk about now. So hypermasculinity, kind of some different ideas of this. So hypermasculinity is taking the masculine ideal, but we're going to hyper it, right? So it's going to put it on steroids, so to speak. And hypermasculinity. So one example I oftentimes go to is the Incredible Hulk, a Marvel superhero, and representations of the Incredible Hulk today are just like, I mean, it's just massive being, right? And if you go back to like, there was a TV show in the 1970s called The Incredible Hulk, played by Lou Ferrigno, who was actually a bodybuilder. It's kind of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde kind of thing, where when he would get angry, he would morph. He was a scientist, Bill Bixby. But when he got really angry, he morphed into this Incredible Hulk, turned into this sort of, but he was a real figure. I mean, it was Lou Ferrigno, played by a bodybuilder. You could say it may be a little bit of hypermasculinity, but the world became really hypermasculine. Like the representations of masculinity really fundamentally changed, starting in the 1970s, 1980s. Superman look at images of Superman over the course of time. Rambo, First Blood, 1980, and look at sort of over a course of time. Dominance is being represented in different ways. So hypermasculinity in the context 1970s, 1980s, like, okay, what's going on in that particular context? I mean, most academic thought goes to feminist movement. Women are entering in the workforce in ways that they, in a more numerically, just entering fields they had not entered before, becoming involved in positions of leadership that they had not been in before at the levels that they were moving into. The masculinity was being challenged in culture and society. The working class, so the social class issues are important as well. The income and the wages for the bottom 40% of society has basically been stagnant starting in the 1970s to today. In fact, the bottom 20 some percent has fallen. So males have it, and they're competing in this world that's different, where they had assumed gendered advantage in the past. Now gendered advantage is being put under question, economically more vulnerable. And one response to some of that stuff is a sort of hypermasculine kind of response. That's the argument and the perspective. I think the other part of technology plays a role. The ability to create images in a different way than before, computer technology, CGI, different things like that I think are an important part as well. But again, it's taken apart in a cultural context. Like, okay, why are those images so resonate so much in that particular landscape? So I think you could relate this. We could bring in Mead and Cooley a little bit start thinking about how this starts to shape identity to shape ideas about gender. And we'll come back to matrix of domination maybe a little bit. Okay, so we could apply the same idea to hegemonic femininities. Like, what is the dominant ideal about femininity? How do we sort of see representations of the female body? These are all white female bodies. And they're probably assumed heterosexual bodies as well. So, you know, look at intersectionality. Let's not talk about homophobia. I'm kind of just rather kind of end things. We'll maybe talk about discophobia in class. So we can bring in the matrix of domination by looking at basically the matrix, right? It's important to kind of revisit this. So looking at the micro to the macro, looking at the intersectionality between different parts of our identity, and then making this sort of connection between privilege and domination, right? And then finally, is we start thinking about how does the social world become reproduced, where there's advantage and disadvantage, privileging and dominating in this world. We have to start thinking about the different realms. Let's start thinking about the structural realm, area of representation, and the interactional. Now, I know that Patricia Hill Collins talked about, you know, the coercive realm, the hegemonic coercive realm. So I'm kind of putting in, kind of moving us, like in Hill Collins' work, she identified 4 realms, and they're all, there's one way of looking at it. I'm introducing, basically reorganizing those a little bit. A more common way of talking about these realms is the structural, representational, and the interactional. So kind of moving us in that direction a little bit. The structure is like, think about institutions, think about the law, think about policies within organizations, think about, you know, number of women who are serving in terms of as a federal senator or a House of Representatives member, as a representative. What are the structural things that are going on that are shaping the number of males or females within those particular positions? We can think about, again, think about the law, think about just sort of structural kind of stuff. Representation, a little bit more self-explanatory, kind of getting into representations, not only, you know, the mass media for sure, you know, the mass media ranging from major productions all the way to, you know, little flyers, advertisements that come across, you know, in the newspaper or in flyers that come into your mailbox, you know, whatever it might be. And then interactional is the meaning that we make based on, or the ways in which gender kind of is working, gender dynamics are working within an interactional kind of context. So between self and other. All right, so that's kind of the landscape. Look forward to our conversation this week on kind of unpackaging, distinguishing between sex and gender. And hopefully, like, you can start to make these connections between race and gender, some of the same things that were going on in terms of biological notions of race. We're also going on in terms of biological notions of gender, social construction of race, social construction of gender, and kind of like deconstructing and reconstructing ideas about gender that are based on more contemporary sensibilities and understanding, as well as more based on more objective ways of knowing versus the way, you know, scientific racism in the past. You could talk about scientific sexism of the past as well. So moving to a more reasoned and more sound kind of perspective about gender today. All right, with that being said, have a great rest of your day. Look forward to seeing you in class. If you have any questions, let me know.